This video is brought to you by the Logitech Lightspeed Wireless range of keyboards, mice and headsets, the benchmark in wireless gaming performance.
Need for Speed Hot Pursuit Remastered, released late last year on PlayStation 4, Xbox One, the Switch, and I guess even the PC. But due to the arrival of the next generation consoles, we didn't get a chance to cover it at the time. But just recently, it received a new update enabling new graphics modes specifically designed to leverage the power of the new machine, so we thought, why not take a look at it now? And there's no better person to discuss this game with than the man who covered it back in the day when it first released on the PlayStation 3 and 360, Richard Ledbetter.
John, this is awesome, isn't it? I mean, Need for Speed Hot Pursuit. I mean, we were talking before this about peak Criterion and so many amazing games during this particular period. Some people think that this is peak Criterion, their best ever game. Some people think it's Burnout Paradise, some Burnout 2 or Burnout 3. I think it just goes to show just what kind of phenomenal levels of output this UK developer was producing at the time, and it's just so awesome to come back to this one, because I think this was possibly their last truly great game.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and I feel like this was released at the perfect time when the Need for Speed series was starting to falter a little bit, and to bring Criterion in to do this, it sort of embodies everything that made the classic Need for Speed games great. Just these wide open, beautiful tracks, lots of great cars to play with, and some really fun action. And you know what? Seeing this again in the remastered version, I'm really amazed at how well it holds up, because this is still a beautiful game, despite the fact that it hasn't actually changed that much visually, which we'll discuss in a moment. But first, let's get the full picture here on what all the different consoles are doing. We're mainly going to be focusing on the PS5 and Series X for this one, but let's lay it out. So this game obviously supports the base PS4 and Xbox One, and it does 1080p 30. The Switch version also does 1080p 30 when docked, and 720p 30 in portable mode. PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, when they launched, had two modes. You could do a 4K 30 mode, which was beautiful with excellent anti-aliasing and just super pristine image quality, and then a 1080p 60 mode. But now, thanks to this new update, they've unlocked something called the maximum mode, which essentially bumps it up to 4K 60. But this isn't really a case of back compat plus, I think, as this mode actually applies to the last gen enhanced consoles as well.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think this is actually a really good plan, because essentially what it does is effectively the same as back compat plus, in that you have the unlocked frame rate, which taps out at 60 frames per second, which is pretty awesome. But I suspect that just adding it to the existing code base means they don't need to migrate across to the latest cross-generation SDKs. They can stay on the old one, and you get effectively the same end result, 60 frames per second. It's actually quite interesting here, because looking over your stats here, so many of the versions are running at 30 frames per second, just like the original game, which was actually a really contentious thing back in the day, because it was pretty much Criterion's first racing game running at 30 frames per second.
That's right, it was. So they had to drop that down to pull off the visuals they were aiming for on PlayStation 3 and 360.
Yeah, but at the same time, they were doing some amazing things. You know, they were running everything off a single thread, using parallelism to access, you know, all of the capabilities of the host platforms, but running on a single thread for lowest possible latency at 30 frames per second. So at the time, we were measuring input lag on PS3 and 360 on this game at levels that are on par with some 60 FPS games. I think it was like 83 milliseconds end to end, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's really great for a 30 FPS game, and you could really feel it. So it actually worked pretty well, and when you added the motion blur, you know, it looked really good for the platform, I would say.
But 60 is obviously where you want to be,
exactly.
And all of those latency benefits would roll forward to this as well.
Precisely.
So yeah, it just feels really crisp, feels really good, and as you say, it's been a pleasure to come back to. And I just think the overall design, as you say, holds up over time.
Yeah, and I think that, that's kind of where we get into the remastering efforts here. So I kind of looked at this, comparing it to the original. I mean, the main difference is they updated things like the UI, they did some AI upscaling on all the videos, the pre-rendered stuff. They improved various effects. The reflections on the cars are much higher resolution. Some of the textures were touched up. But things like that, it does look good overall, but it's not that different. The key is that what they did during that period still holds up today, even with the minimal touch-ups. It's really, really a good-looking game. And what I especially love, and this is why I like track-based games so much, is that it has this sense of scale, where the tracks just sort of like stretch way out into the distance, and you come over these hills and you just see these massive swooping S-bends in the track and other things like that, and it's just awesome to race on, and it feels great to drift around those corners.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's it's kind of interesting to compare it to Burnout Paradise because it's so different, but there's so many things that are very, very similar. Once you get into the kind of road rage style events, with the hot pursuits, feels very much like Burnout, but the visual signature of the game, very, very different. You got these amazing vistas. It's just phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely. And so obviously then the big thing here, as we said, is the 60 FPS update on the new consoles, which makes all of this feel better than it did before. Or I guess more specifically, now it feels like the PC version, which is not a bad thing. I mean, that's, the PC version still holds up as well, including the remastered version. And the only downside here, though, is that because of the way that this seems to not utilize Back Compat Plus, it means that Xbox Series S owners are left out in the cold, as the game only runs in the 1 mode, or 1S mode.
Yeah, and that's actually a real shame because, when you look at the GPU multipliers, S to S, it's bigger than X to X. And I just feel that 1080p 60 could easily have been achieved on this.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that you can see the cap sort of engage on the S, where when you pause the game and then unpause it, it'll run at 60 FPS for just a brief little moment, and then the cap sort of kicks back in and it clamps down to 30. So
that is very, very strange.
Exactly. So that's one example where moving this to the so-called Back Compat Plus, the latest SDK and all that, probably would have allowed the Series S to deliver something else, but at least if you're on the Series X or PS5, you really get these benefits. So I think we should talk about the performance, because it's not as straightforward as I expected, because there's one very peculiar thing with the Xbox version that we both noticed.
Yeah.
So actually, let's just start. So PS5, basically, there's no story here in terms of the overall performance. It is just 60 frames per second flat. And in fact, actually, I should say before we continue, I also did briefly test the old 4K 30 and 1080p 60 mode, and those are, as you would expect, completely flawless on the new consoles, because they were already pretty much flawless on the last gen consoles as well. So this is all about the new maximum mode, and that's exactly where the PS5 just delivers flat 60 across the board. I played maybe like 15 races over the course of Capture, and it just, not a single blip, not even one. So that's what I would expect. But Series X, and this is where you first played it as well, it seems like, oh yeah, this is just going to be straightforward, the same exact thing. And it mostly is, except in this one spot.
Well, we call it one spot, but it's because of the nature of the map. You encounter this spot a lot during different circuits, right?
Yeah, so that's the main thing. There's this section of track, and it's about 3 turns worth here, where it's in the coastal region, where there's all these rocks and everything, and you kind of go around these turns. Every time you get here, the frame rate starts to drop. And it happens in any event that takes you to this area. And it can be a little better or worse depending on what's going on during that specific event, but this area always causes drops on Xbox. And so I was puzzled by this, obviously, because it's like, it doesn't really make sense. Like, is there some sort of visibility calling issue? Something else going on? Like, just something inherent in this map data on the Xbox version that's causing this problem. But thankfully, the last gen enhanced consoles actually allow us to sort of more easily appreciate what's happening here. So I kind of use these as a benchmark.
Okay.
So PS4 Pro. I loaded this up first, switched to maximum mode, and it's 4K with an uncapped frame rate, and the average frame rate according to our tools was 50 frames per second, which is actually what EA noted in the website there.
Okay.
But it kind of ranges from about 40 up to 55 most of the time. But it's a very sort of a consistent line. Like, it doesn't like lurch up or down in any significant ways. It just kind of goes along at a stable rate. So I loaded up the same first race on Xbox One X, which has a more capable GPU than the PS4 Pro, and it actually gets very close to holding 60 FPS. So that's really nice. It's actually a lot closer than you would have expected. It has some dips, but it's good. So that kind of jives with the difference between those two machines. It's kind of what you would expect. But here's the thing. When you get to that same area on the One X, you'll notice that the performance starts to drop pretty hard, with the lowest I found around 33 FPS or so.
Wow.
And when you compare it with PS4 Pro directly, normally the two lines kind of run parallel, but during this section, I tried to match it up as best as I could here, but you can kind of see the One X kind of has these peaks and valleys going above and below the PS4 Pro version. So it's something very specific to this area, and you can really see it in action here on the last gen machines. So it's something specific to the way that this area is handled on the Xbox version.
Curious. So yeah, well, there's two things from my perspective here. First of all, it's quite an interesting benchmark of sorts that you've got there, since both are not quite hitting 60 frames per second. You know, we didn't actually quite get too many precise head-to-head benchmark face-offs on the enhanced consoles last year, so that's quite interesting. But secondly, seems like from an optimization level, things are kind of sticking to their render time budgets on PlayStation, but that one area, and it seems to be that one area only on the Xbox side, doesn't. And you wouldn't have noticed it back in the day, because 1080p 60 on the One X, absolutely fine. 4K 30, absolutely fine. But here, with the frame rate limiter removed, it does actually become evident, and it seems to sort of transfer across to the next gen machines as well, or rather Series X.
Precisely, and that's so. You know, I kind of raise this point because I think it's actually really interesting to look at, and this is sort of a case where the performance differential is clearly just based on the software here. So this is not a real comparison of the hardware platforms per se. It's just showcasing a time where the hardware or the results from the machine are not what you would expect based on the average performance level elsewhere in the game. So just kind of a weird little quirk and something to note. And I'll be curious to see if it can be fixed. I mean, I assume it could. It's just a matter of whether it will or not. But I don't want to get too focused on that. I think it's really interesting, but overall, I mean, the Xbox version is fine, and most areas are completely locked 60 as well, so you're not really having an issue there, but that is a strange spot. And the thing is I first noticed this when I was playing with VRR engaged, and VRR does not seem to mitigate the problem either, which was kind of an odd thing.
Yeah. I don't know. It is a curious one, and on the one hand, it is kind of like an isolated area, and it's not going to impact your enjoyment of the game too much. But on the other hand, because it is basically, you know, a singular map with lots of circuits traversing different areas of the map, you do encounter it quite a lot more frequently than you think you would.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those things where you kind of revisit that area multiple times on multiple different tracks, anything on the coast. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's just kind of an interesting little quirk there.
Okay, and we have auto HDR on this as well, right?
That's actually another really nice thing that's worth mentioning is auto HDR does a great job here. It really brings out the vibrancy and the color of the game, and it also looks excellent at night when you're doing a race during a storm and you get those flashes of lightning. It's extremely bright with HDR enabled, and it looks really nice.
Brilliant.
So that is in fact new. And it also got me thinking about how you actually test for HDR these days. It's a little bit less obvious than it was before. Because on the PS5, normally HDR is either always on or always off, and things are just tone mapped. And on Xbox, you have to disable auto HDR but leave HDR enabled to see if it enters HDR mode. So to be sure, I actually ended up just loading the game up on the PS4 Pro just to see if it would trigger the HDR mode, and it does not.
Fair enough.
So,
well, this has been an interesting discussion, especially in light of the news that Criterion, who are moving back to Need for Speed, have had their plans put back for the next Need for Speed game, and instead they're going to be collaborating with DICE on the next Battlefield. So on the one hand, I guess from a commercial perspective, this makes sense for EA, but for me, from a personal perspective, I'd rather play a Need for Speed Criterion game than a Battlefield game, so I'm a bit disappointed. But on the flip side, I guess we've got Need for Speed Remastered, which just reminds us of the glory days and just really holds up beautifully even today.
That's true. And hey, I'd rather they delay the Need for Speed game and allow Criterion to work on this other project rather than still requiring both to ship at similar times. So I hope they take the time to get this new Need for Speed right, because I feel like the series really needs this. So I look forward to seeing what it becomes when it hits, hopefully in 2022. But I guess we'll find out. But I guess that's going to do it for now. So thanks for joining me on this one, Rich.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I really love this game. It's been great to revisit it.
Yeah, likewise. It's a ton of fun. Fantastic pick up and play game. So definitely do check it out, especially if you've not played it before, because it is one of the best Need for Speed games of the last 20 years, I'd say. So, but anyway, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, check out our Patreon, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.
A breakthrough in design and engineering, the G915 features Lightspeed Pro-Grade Wireless, Advanced LightSync RGB, and new high-performance, low-profile mechanical switches. Meticulously crafted from premium materials, the G15 is a sophisticated design of unparalleled beauty, strength and performance. Meet G15 Lightspeed and play the next dimension.